The millionaire's son had a problem that neither money nor the best doctors could solve. Almost every night, he would walk around the house while sleeping. The father, desperate and exhausted, didn't know what to do anymore, fearing for the boy's safety. That's when a new housekeeper, a quiet and observant woman, was hired to work at the mansion. No one paid much attention to her until one night, the father woke up to a strange noise. When he went out into the hallway, the scene he saw left him in shock, questioning everything he thought he knew about his son and the house they lived in. Arthur Sterling's empire was a fortress of glass and steel, built on a foundation of relentless ambition. Each floor of his Manhattan skyscraper represented a triumph, a masterstroke on Wall Street, a bold investment that had turned into exponential profit. He was a man who understood numbers, strategy, how to convert capital into power. His fortune was a living entity, a colossus that fed on stocks, dividends, and compound interest accumulating in accounts scattered across the globe, amounting to a net worth in dollars that most people couldn't even conceive of. He had built a legacy, a dynasty, but within the walls of his own home, a cold marble mansion in Greenwich that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Arthur was an impotent king. His only son, Leo, an 8-year-old boy with eyes that carried the grief of his mother's absence, was the heir to all that wealth, but also the prisoner of an affliction no amount of money could cure. Every night, the terror repeated itself. The boy would rise, his eyes open but devoid of any spark of consciousness, and wander the silent hallways. Leo's sleepwalking was a shadow that crept through the house, a ghost that mocked his father's powerlessness. Arthur had turned the mansion into a high-tech prison, motion sensors, silent alarms that vibrated on his wrist, night watchmen who patrolled the perimeter like sentinels guarding a cursed treasure. He had consulted the best doctors, the most renowned therapists in the country, but they all left their appointments with the same look of pity and defeat. Hope had run dry. The head housekeeper, Judith, a woman whose rigidity seemed carved from the same marble as the corridors, was the personification of the cold order that reigned in the house. Her solution was simple and brutal: sedatives, medicine that promised peaceful nights but stole Leo's vivacity during the day, leaving him in a state of drowsy lethargy, a little ghost in his own life. Arthur hated it, but the fear of finding his son fallen at the bottom of a staircase was even greater. The change, when it came, didn't arrive with the fanfare of a new promise, but with the quiet whisper of an administrative need. One of the cleaning staff resigned, and a replacement was hired. Her name was Helena. She was a middle-aged woman with a face that seemed like a map of untold stories and a gaze that conveyed a deep, ancient calm. Unlike the other staff, who moved with robotic efficiency, Helena brought with her a soft scent of lavender and an aura of common sense that seemed to warm the mansion's frigid air. She didn't bow before the magnitude of the wealth, nor was she intimidated by Judith's severity. And that's when Arthur began to notice. Through the cameras that monitored every inch of the house, he saw small gestures. He saw how she spoke to Leo, not with the patronizing baby talk others used, but with genuine respect, as if speaking to an equal. And Leo, his silent boy who had closed himself off to the world, responded, not with words, but with a look. A tilt of his head, a small gesture that was a universe of communication in his silent world. Hope, that luxury Arthur thought he had lost forever, began to sprout in his chest, tiny and fragile, like a stubborn flower pushing through a crack in the concrete. He found himself spending more time in his home office, not to manage his multi-million-dollar deals, but to watch this simple woman, whose serene presence seemed to challenge the shadows that haunted his house and his heart. In that first week, he saw her pause for a moment in front of the boy's room and, in a silent and almost imperceptible act of rebellion, move an old teddy bear, a gift from Leo's mother that Judith had banished to the highest shelf, to the edge of the bed, within reach of his small hand. That gesture, so small and so laden with meaning, made Arthur's heart stop. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a mix of surprise, admiration, and an unsettling doubt about everything he had accepted as truth. Who was this woman who dared to defy the order of his fortress with a simple teddy bear? The image of that simple teddy bear, positioned like a silent sentinel beside his son, haunted Arthur throughout the next day. In his professional life, he was a master of analyzing data, of identifying patterns in stock charts and predicting the fluctuations of the crypto market. Every decision regarding his vast assets was calculated, based on cold logic and profitability projections. He had built his empire on the certainty of numbers, the predictability of assets. However, Helena's gesture was a data point he couldn't process, a variable that didn't fit into any of his spreadsheets. It was an act of pure and simple humanity, and that destabilized him deeply. He spent most of the morning in his office, business reports spread across the mahogany desk, but his eyes constantly drifted to the security monitors. He watched Judith make her morning rounds. The housekeeper moved with the precision of a general inspecting her troops. Her sharp eyes missed not a speck of dust, not an object out of place. When she entered Leo's room, her body visibly stiffened at the sight of the teddy bear on the bed. She picked it up with her fingertips, as if touching something contagious, and placed it back on the highest shelf, her face a mask of disapproval. Later, Arthur saw the exact moment Judith confronted Helena in one of the hallways. The camera didn't capture sound, but the body language was eloquent. Judith gestured sharply, pointing in the direction of Leo's room. Helena listened with her head slightly tilted, her hands clasped in front of her. There was no subservience in her posture, but an unshakable calm that seemed to irritate the housekeeper even more. After the reprimand, Helena resumed her work, but Arthur noticed a new dimension to her presence. There was a sadness in her eyes, but also a quiet determination. That afternoon, while cleaning the playroom where Leo spent most of his waking hours, she did something extraordinary. The boy was sitting on the floor, listlessly stacking wooden blocks. Helena, passing by, accidentally dropped her feather duster near him. When she bent down to pick it up, her eyes met Leo's. She smiled, a small, genuine smile that asked for nothing in return. And then, the miracle. Leo, his son, who barely looked up at the world, smiled back. It was a ghost of a smile, as fleeting as the flutter of a hummingbird's wings, but it was there. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He rewound the recording, watched it again and again. That smile was worth more than all the gold in his vaults, more than any profit his investments could ever yield. Judith's order was logic, protocol, the safe path that he, as a good asset manager, had followed. But logic hadn't brought a single smile to his son's face. Helena's quiet rebellion had... The doubt that had been born the night before now morphed into a nagging suspicion. What if Judith, with all her efficiency and her professional methods, was wrong? What if the cure for his son's darkness wasn't in more control, but in less? Night fell, and with it, Arthur's usual anxiety. He ate dinner alone in the immense dining room, the silence amplified by the clinking of silver cutlery. He thought about his cash flow, his treasury bonds, the inheritance he was building for Leo, but for the first time, the vastness of his wealth felt empty, useless. What good was being a billionaire if he couldn't buy his own son's peace of mind? That thought propelled him. He could no longer be a passive spectator in his own home. He went upstairs, not to his own room, but to Leo's. The door was ajar. Inside, Judith was preparing the nightly dose of the calming drops. Leo sat on the bed, passive, waiting. Arthur felt a wave of revulsion. He was about to intervene, to stop the scene, when he saw something that made him freeze in the hallway. Tucked under Leo's pillow, barely visible, was the old teddy bear. Arthur remained motionless in the hallway, a spectre in his own home. He watched Judith administer the liquid from the small glass, the gesture quick and efficient, devoid of any tenderness. Leo swallowed, passive, his eyes already clouded by the chemical that promised him a dreamless sleep but robbed him of the essence of childhood. The housekeeper straightened the sheets with military precision and left, closing the door with a soft click that, to Arthur, sounded like the locking of a cell. He waited for the sound of her footsteps to fade down the hall and then entered the room. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air, a sterile fragrance that tried in vain to erase any trace of life. Leo was already nearly asleep, but his small hand moved instinctively, searching for something under his pillow. His fingers closed around the bear's soft fur. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. That small act of defiance, that shared secret between his son and the cleaner, was proof that Leo's spirit was still fighting. He, the tycoon who managed a vast fortune, who made decisions affecting the capital flow of entire nations, felt like a complete failure. His assets, his holdings, his investment funds seemed like a pile of useless paper in the face of that scene. The next morning, Arthur broke his routine. Instead of locking himself in his office for the conference call with his managers in Zurich, he went down to the garden. The morning sun bathed the rose bushes, and it was there he found Helena. Carefully pruning the dead branches, he approached, feeling strangely clumsy. "Good morning," he said, his voice sounding more formal than he intended. Helena turned, unstartled. "Good morning, sir," she replied, her eyes clear and direct. He tried to make small talk, asking about the roses, about the garden. He spoke of how his late wife had loved this place. It was a test, a way to see her reaction. Helena didn't offer facile condolences or platitudes. She just nodded, a gesture of silent understanding that was more comforting than any words. "They miss a gentle touch," she said, referring to the flowers, "like people." The phrase, so simple and so profound, hit Arthur squarely. He, who measured the value of everything in returns and dividends, realized there was a kind of wealth he had never considered. The tension in the house, however, escalated. Judith, with her nose for any shift in the atmosphere, noticed her employer's interest in the new staff member. Her surveillance became more overt. She began to follow Helena, inspecting her work with unnecessary rigor, looking for a flaw, a pretext to get rid of her. One day, Arthur saw on the cameras Judith berating Helena for leaving a small vase with a single white rose in Leo's room. "The boy has allergies," Judith lied, her voice hard and sharp as she threw the flower in the trash. She then instituted a new rule. No staff member was to interact directly with Leo so as not to disrupt his therapeutic routine. It was a clear decree, a wall Judith was building around the boy, and Arthur knew the primary target of that order was Helena. The house, once just cold, had now become a silent battlefield. The evening arrived, charged with an electricity Arthur could feel on his skin. He skipped dinner, anxiety gnawing at his stomach. He knew something was about to happen. Lying in his bed, the silence of the mansion was deafening. Then it came, the vibration on his wrist, the silent alarm that always announced the start of his nightly nightmare. Leo was up. The familiar, icy terror seized Arthur. He leaped out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind painting the worst-case scenarios. He ran down the hallway, the sound of his bare feet muffled by the Persian rug. He turned the corner leading to the grand staircase, the most dangerous point in the house, expecting to find the small silhouette of his son at the edge of the abyss. But what he saw paralyzed him, suspending the air in his lungs and time on its axis. The scene before him was not one of peril. It was one of inexplicable and shocking peace. In the dimly lit hallway, bathed only by the milky moonlight filtering through a high window, Leo's silhouette moved with its usual slow, somnambulistic pace, but he was not alone. Beside him, walking at the same measured rhythm, was Helena. Arthur's heart, which seconds before had been pounding in a frantic panic, now seemed to have stopped altogether. He shrank into the shadow of the archway, an intruder in his own house, watching a scene that defied all logic and every protocol that had governed his life for the past few years. Helena wasn't holding the boy tightly, not restraining him. Her hand simply enveloped Leo's, a connection that was both firm and gentle, an anchor in the darkness, and she was singing. The melody was low and soft, an ancient lullaby in a language Arthur didn't recognize, but whose melancholy and tenderness were universal. The notes floated in the silent air, weaving a tapestry of calm over the anguish that always accompanied Leo's nightly wanderings. The boy, his eyes open and vacant, had a relaxed face. The mask of distress, the furrowed brow, the tight lips that so tormented Arthur, was gone. In its place was an almost supernatural serenity. He wasn't fighting invisible demons. He was being guided by a silent angel. Arthur watched, fascinated and bewildered, as Helena guided Leo, not immediately back to his room, but on a short loop through the hall. As if she understood that the boy's soul needed to complete its nightly journey, not be abruptly cut short. She led him away from the stairs, around the gallery of ancestral portraits, whose oil-painted eyes seemed to observe the scene with the same disbelief as Arthur. The family fortune, the severe faces of the men who built the wealth he now possessed, seemed like mute witnesses to how the simplest of human gestures outmatched the most complex electronic security. Finally, she led him back to his bed. With infinite delicacy, she arranged the sheets, covered his small body, and instead of leaving, she sat on the edge of the mattress. She continued to hum quietly, her hand resting lightly on Leo's chest until his breathing became deep and regular, a true and peaceful sleep. Only then did she stand, pick up the teddy bear that had fallen to the floor, and place it in the boy's arms. Before leaving, she leaned down and placed a soft kiss on Leo's forehead, a gesture of pure, motherly affection that made Arthur's heart ache with both pain and immense gratitude. She left the room, closing the door with infinite care, and for an instant, her gaze swept across the dark hallway. Arthur shrank back further, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to break the spell of that moment. He didn't know if she had seen him, but on her face, for a fraction of a second, he saw the weight of the world, the wisdom of one who knows pain, and the compassion of one who knows how to heal it. That night, the seed of doubt that had sprouted in his mind blossomed into an overwhelming conviction. Everything he thought he knew about his son's problem was wrong. The expensive diagnoses, Judith's rigid methods, the technological fortress he had built, it was all an illusion. The answer wasn't in science or discipline, but in something much older and more fundamental, human connection. He returned to his room but couldn't sleep. The image of Helena guiding Leo down the hall was seared into his mind. The chaos he had so feared, in her hands, seemed more serene and healing than the order imposed by Judith and her sedatives. He sat in his armchair, the city stretching out below like a carpet of glittering lights, each light representing a life, a business, a flow of money. He was the master of that universe, a billionaire whose decisions could make or break fortunes. But there, in the solitude of his room, he felt like the most ignorant of men. He had tried to solve his son's suffering the same way he solved his business problems, with money, with technology, with the best professionals, and he had failed miserably. The cure, it seemed, was not an investment one could make. It was a gift one had to receive. And that gift had come in the form of a quiet cleaner who smelled of lavender and had a lullaby in her soul. The next day dawned with a new clarity for Arthur. He knew he could no longer ignore the truth. He had to act. He went down to breakfast with a determination he hadn't felt in years. He found Judith in the dining room, supervising the table setting with her usual critical eye. "Judith," he began, his voice firm, "we need to talk about Leo's treatment. I want to suspend the nightly medication. Effective today. The housekeeper turned to him, a perfectly arched eyebrow a signal of surprise and disapproval. Her mask of professionalism was impenetrable, but Arthur could see a flicker of fury in her eyes. The battle for control of this house and for his son's soul was about to begin. Judith's reaction was immediate and calculated. She didn't raise her voice or openly show her insubordination. Instead, she adopted a tone of professional concern, a tactic she knew was effective with Arthur. "Sir," she said, her voice low and laden with false gravity, "I understand your distress, but I must remind you that Leo's treatment was prescribed by a team of physicians. Stopping the medication abruptly could be dangerous. The protocol is clear." The word protocol hung in the air between them. For Arthur, a man of business who had built his fortune on rules and strategies, that word had always been a safe harbor. But now it sounded hollow, meaningless. What he had seen last night followed no protocol. It followed instinct, empathy, the heart. "The protocol isn't working, Judith," he replied, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel that surprised even himself. "Leo still wanders the house every night. The only difference is that the sedatives leave him lethargic and unhappy during the day." Judith's expression tightened. "Sleepwalking is a complex disorder. The sedative is to prevent him from getting hurt, to ensure his safety. The alternative is chaos, constant risk." "The chaos I saw last night," Arthur countered, choosing his words carefully, "seemed more peaceful than the order we've been imposing on him." He didn't reveal what he had witnessed. He wouldn't throw Helena to the housekeeper's mercy. But the seed of discord had been planted. Judith, sensing that her authority was being questioned for the first time in years, changed tactics. "With all due respect, sir, you manage a financial empire. I manage this household and your son's well-being. They are different fields of expertise. Perhaps you should trust the person with experience in the matter." It was a precise, low blow, an attempt to put him in his place, to remind him of the division of roles that had always existed between them. But something in Arthur had shifted. He was no longer just the employer who signed the checks. He was a father who had glimpsed a spark of hope. "My decision is final, Judith. No more medication, starting tonight. We're going to try a new approach." The housekeeper's gaze was icy. "As you wish, sir," she said, and the deference in her words was a thin veneer over a barely contained fury. She withdrew from the room, her posture rigid and offended. Arthur knew he had declared war. Later that day, he sought out Helena. He found her in the library, polishing the collection of antique terrestrial globes. He closed the door, a gesture indicating this was not a conversation between employer and employee. "Helena," he began, "I saw what you did last night." She stopped what she was doing, the flannel cloth still in her hand, but she didn't seem surprised. There was a quiet acceptance in her eyes. "I saw how you calmed him, how you guided him back to bed." She remained silent, waiting. "I need to understand," he continued, his voice heavy with a vulnerability he rarely showed. "The best doctors in the country couldn't achieve what you did with a lullaby. How?" Helena considered for a moment, choosing her words with the same care she used to prune the roses. "I don't have any degrees, sir. I don't understand medicine, but I understand a broken heart." "The boy isn't sick. He's heartbroken." The simplicity of those words hit him like a wave. Heartbroken. That was it. A pain so deep it manifested while his body slept. "Sometimes," Helena continued, "a child's soul just needs to know it's not alone in the dark. It needs a hand to hold until the morning comes." Arthur, the man who commanded a net worth in the billions, who understood interest rates and assets, felt like a student before a teacher. He told her about his decision to suspend the sedatives. A flicker of approval crossed her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a shadow of concern. "Mrs. Judith will not be pleased," she said simply. "I'll handle Judith," Arthur replied. "I just need you to keep doing what you're doing. Be there for him." "I always will be, sir." she promised. The growing closeness between Arthur and Helena did not go unnoticed. Judith watched every glance, every conversation, with mounting resentment. To her, Helena wasn't just a cleaner overstepping her duties. She was a direct threat to her authority, to her control over the house and, more importantly, over Leo. The tension became palpable. Judith's orders to Helena grew sharper, her criticisms more frequent. She accused her of interference and of using unprofessional methods that could confuse the child. The house, once a place of oppressive silence, now vibrated with a silent and cold war. And it was this tension, this battle of wills, that pushed Arthur to take an action that would change everything. He could no longer trust appearances. If Judith was willing to fight so hard for a protocol that clearly wasn't working, perhaps there was something more behind her insistence. That night, after Judith had administered the final dose of the gentle, calming drops to Leo, Arthur waited for her to leave and then entered the room. With his heart pounding, he took the small glass bottle from the medicine cabinet, a bottle with a simple, handwritten label. Discreetly, using a syringe he had purchased that afternoon, he drew a small sample of the clear liquid. He needed answers, and he knew the truth was right there, in that little glass bottle. The 2 days that followed were a torment of silence and anticipation. Every ring of the phone made Arthur's heart leap. He tried to focus on his business, on analyzing stock market performance, on planning a new investment in renewable energy technology. But his mind was a turbulent sea. The lab report was the only thing that mattered, a single sheet of paper that held the key to his family's future. A document more valuable than any treasury bond. The absence of the sedatives, however, worked a subtle but miraculous transformation in Leo. The first night, Arthur didn't sleep. He stayed in his office, his eyes fixed on the monitors, waiting for the alarm on his watch to vibrate. But the night passed in a blessed, uninterrupted silence. For the first time in years, Leo slept through the night. Arthur went to his son's room in the pre-dawn hours and watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, his face serene. The peace of that scene was a richness he had never known. During the day, the change was even more remarkable. The fog of lethargy that had always enveloped Leo began to lift. His eyes seemed clearer, more present. He spent the afternoon in the garden with Helena, helping her water the flowers. Arthur watched from his office window, and for the first time, he heard his son's laughter, a crystalline, fragile sound that seemed to have the power to mend the broken pieces of his own heart. That laugh was the most precious return he had ever received on any investment. Judith, however, watched this evolution with a thinly veiled resentment. Leo's improvement was a living refutation of her methods and a threat to her dominion. She approached Arthur at the end of the second day, her expression heavy with theatrical concern. "Sir, I'm pleased to see Leo more active," she began, her voice unctuous. "But we mustn't be deceived. This could be a honeymoon phase. His condition hasn't been treated, merely masked by these unorthodox methods of Helena's. It's unpredictable, it's dangerous." She was trying to plant the seed of fear, to undermine the trust he was placing in Helena. What if next time he doesn't just walk down the hall? What if he goes to the pool? This woman's influence over him is inappropriate. She has no qualifications. Arthur listened to her in silence. Before, those words would have filled him with panic. Now, he saw the manipulation behind the false concern. "I appreciate your opinion, Judith," he said, his voice as cold as steel. "But for now, we will continue with the current approach." The exchange left a bitter taste in his mouth. The veiled accusation against Helena, Judith's attempt to paint compassion as a danger, only reinforced his suspicions. The truth needed to come out, and quickly. He was in his office late that afternoon, the light of the setting sun cutting the room into golden stripes. He stared at the skyline. at the skyscrapers that represented his power and fortune, feeling more isolated than ever. His personal cell phone, the device he used only for urgent and private matters, vibrated on the desk. An unknown number. His stomach tightened. He answered, his hand trembling slightly. "Mr. Sterling?" said a professional, anonymous voice on the other end. "Yes," Arthur replied, his throat dry. "This is the clinical analysis lab. The results of the test you requested are ready." Time seemed to freeze. The distant hum of city traffic, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the office, everything vanished. The only reality was the voice on the phone and the hammering of his own heart against his ribs. "And," Arthur managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper, "Sir, the substance you sent us is not an herbal calmative, as indicated on the vial," the voice said. Neutral and professional, but each word landed like a hammer blow. The toxicological analysis identified the presence of zolpidem in a high concentration. Arthur closed his eyes. He wasn't a doctor, but he lived in the world of business, where information was power. He knew that name, zolpidem, a potent hypnotic, a controlled substance used to treat severe insomnia in adults. What are the side effects in children?" he asked, already dreading the answer. There was a slight pause on the other end, as if the technician were consulting his notes. "In children, its use is not recommended. Adverse effects can be severe and unpredictable. They include sleepwalking, amnesiac episodes, agitation, and in some cases, hallucinations." The floor gave way beneath his feet. The truth was so monstrous, so perverse, that his mind refused to process it. It wasn't a treatment. It was a slow, deliberate poisoning. Judith wasn't trying to cure Leo's sleepwalking. She was causing it. Night after night, she had created the disease to then sell the cure, to justify her expensive methods, her authority, her indispensable position in that house. His son's nightly terror, his own anguish as a father, the constant risk, it had all been a cruel sham, orchestrated by the woman he trusted most. A wave of ice-cold fury washed over him, a rage so intense it left him breathless. Every dollar he had spent on specialists, every sleepless night, every desperate tear, all because of a lie. She had not only endangered his son's life, but she had also stolen his childhood, his joy, his peace. He thanked the technician in a voice he barely recognized as his own, and hung up. For a long moment, he stood motionless, the phone in his hand, the invisible lab report burning in his mind, the empire he had built, his vast capital, his ability to read the stock market and anticipate trends. It was all useless. He'd been deceived in the most brutal way imaginable, not in a boardroom, but under his own roof. Judith's mask of professionalism, her false concern, her warnings about chaos, it all snapped together into a hideous puzzle. She needed Leo to be a problem so she could be the solution. Helena's closeness, the boy's visible improvement, represented the destruction of her little kingdom of control and manipulation. The rage gave way to a sharp pain and an overwhelming guilt. How could he have been so blind? How could he have let that woman do this to his own son, right under his nose? He, the billionaire Arthur Sterling, who prided himself on his astuteness, had been a fool. His focus had been so trained on accumulating wealth, on growing his net worth, that he had neglected the most important treasure in his life. The sound of his office door opening pulled him from his stupor. It was Helena. She carried a tray with a cup of tea. "You didn't come down for dinner, sir," she said, her voice soft. "I thought you might like some tea." Her eyes met his, and the compassion he saw there was his undoing. The dam of his emotions, so tightly held, broke. He didn't sob, but a single, hot, heavy tear rolled down his cheek. Helena said nothing. She just placed the tray on the desk and waited. In that silence, Arthur made a decision. There would be no yelling, no public accusations. Judith's cruelty would be dealt with the same calculated coldness she had used to harm his family. The stage was set for the climax, a confrontation that would be fought not with weapons, but with the stark, unvarnished truth. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and looked at Helena. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm again. "Please ask Judith to come to my office, now." Helena nodded, her gaze revealing an understanding that went beyond words. She asked no questions. She left the office silently, leaving Arthur alone with the storm brewing inside him. He walked to the window, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the encroaching dusk. Each light was a world, a story, and in his, a monster had disguised herself as a guardian angel. He heard the discreet knock on the door. "Come in," he said, his voice echoing with a cold authority he usually reserved for hostile business negotiations. Judith entered, her posture impeccable, her face a mask of professionalism. "You sent for me, sir?" she asked, her tone perfectly neutral. Arthur remained with his back to her, looking out the window. "Yes, Judith, have a seat." Her hesitation was almost imperceptible. She wasn't used to being given orders this way, to being treated like any other subordinate, but she complied, sitting in the leather chair across from his desk, the silence stretched, heavy and thick. Arthur turned slowly, his face unreadable. He walked to his desk, picked up a single document, the printed lab report the lab had just emailed, and slid it across the polished mahogany surface, stopping it directly in front of her. Judith glanced at the paper, then at Arthur. A flicker of confusion on her brow. "What is this?" she asked. "Read it," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. She picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the first few lines. Arthur watched every micro-expression on her face. He saw the exact moment comprehension dawned, the way the color drained from her cheeks, the way her hand trembled slightly. The mask of professionalism, so carefully maintained for years, began to crack. "I don't know what this is about," she stammered, her voice losing its usual firmness. "This is a forgery. It's absurd. It's the analysis of the gentle, calming drops. You've been giving my son every night," Arthur said, each word a chip of ice. "It's not a calmative, Judith. It's a potent hypnotic. A poison you've been feeding my son to induce the very symptom you pretended to treat." The mask shattered completely. In its place appeared a look of panic, followed by a spark of vicious defiance. "You can't prove a thing," she hissed. "It was prescribed." "Prescribed by whom, Judith?" Arthur pressed, leaning over the desk. "What doctor in their right mind would prescribe zolpidem to an 8-year-old child? You swapped the vials, didn't you? Kept the real medication hidden and put this poison in my son's medicine cabinet. All to maintain your control, to make yourself seem indispensable." Her face twisted into a snarl of hatred. "That woman, that cleaner, she put this in your head. She's trying to take my place." "Helena has nothing to do with this," Arthur said, his voice cutting. "She only did what you never could. She cared about him. She saw him as a suffering child, not a problem to be managed. You, on the other hand, you used him. You used a little boy's pain and a father's desperation to build your petty empire of lies." He straightened up, the final decision etched on his face. "Pack your things. I want you off this property in 1 hour. My lawyers will be in contact. If you ever try anything, if you ever come near my family again, I will use every last cent of my fortune to ensure you never harm anyone ever again." The silence that followed was filled by Judith's ragged breathing. The cruel, manipulative woman was exposed, defeated. She rose, her body trembling with rage and humiliation, and stalked out of the office without another word. Arthur heard her storm up the stairs, her steps hurried and heavy. He sank into his chair, his body suddenly exhausted, as if he'd just fought a long war. The victory brought no joy, only a deep, aching emptiness. His son's healing had begun, but the wound in his own soul was just starting to open. The guilt for his blindness, for his negligence, consumed him. How could he have allowed this to happen? Later that night, he went to Leo's room. The boy was sleeping deeply, the teddy bear nestled in his arms. The peace on his face was the only thing that soothed Arthur's torment. He sat on the edge of the bed, just as he had seen Helena do, and simply stayed there, watching over his son's sleep, a broken father trying to find his way back home. The door opened softly. It was Helena. She was carrying a glass of warm milk. "I thought you might want this," she said, her voice a balm. She looked at Leo's sleeping face, then at Arthur. "He's going to be okay. Children are stronger than we think." "But what about me?" The question escaped Arthur, a whisper of raw pain. "How do I forgive myself for not seeing?" Helena placed the glass on the nightstand and looked at him, her eyes filled with a lifetime of wisdom. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, sir. It illuminates the future. You can't change what happened, but you can change what happens now." Her simple words were an anchor in the storm of his guilt. What happens now? That was the only investment that truly mattered. The first few weeks without Judith were a period of strange and revealing transition. The house, once a temple of sterile silence and rigor, began to breathe. The other staff, previously tense and apprehensive, visibly relaxed. Arthur watched Helena with quiet gratitude. She didn't try to assume the role of housekeeper. Instead, she continued her cleaning work, but with a presence that filled the voids left by Judith's rigidity. She reorganized the pantry, but also the schedule, allowing for more flexibility and a more humane atmosphere for everyone. Leo, stripped of the sedative-induced fog, flourished. The sleepwalking episodes diminished drastically. In the first week without Judith, it happened only once, on the third night. Arthur, alerted by his watch, rushed to the hall and found Helena already there, humming softly as she guided Leo back to bed. He didn't feel like a failure. He felt relieved to have someone who understood, who was there for his son. The house began to fill with the sounds of a childhood Arthur had feared was lost forever. Leo started to play, to draw, to ask questions, and surprisingly, he started to ask about his mother. Arthur had avoided the topic for years, afraid of reliving the pain, afraid of Leo's reaction. He thought silence was the best protection, but Helena encouraged him, with her gentle eyes and simple words. "His mother's memory isn't a wound to be avoided, sir," she said one afternoon, as Arthur watched her arrange books in the library. "It's a gift to be shared. The pain is part of the love, and he needs to know she's still with him, even in a different way." Arthur tried. It was hard at first. His voice would crack, the memories painful. But he began to tell stories about Leo's mother, how she loved the smell of the garden roses, how she laughed, how she was a gifted landscape painter. Leo listened with a ravenous attention, his big, curious eyes absorbing every word. He asked to see photographs, to hear the music she loved. And with every story, every shared laugh, the shadow of sadness that hung over the boy lessened a little more. Arthur realized Helena wasn't just cleaning the house. She was clearing away the cobwebs of grief and silence that had settled in his and his son's hearts. His empire of money, his investments, his vast fortune had been powerless to bring about this healing. It was the simplicity and wisdom of a woman who never spoke of net worth or capital, but of the richness of emotion. One day, Arthur found her in the garden, just as on the first day they'd spoken. But this time, the conversation wasn't about the roses. "Helena," he began, feeling more at ease with her than with anyone else in his life. "I've noticed something. You've never asked me about money, about my work, about any of that." She smiled. A soft, warm smile. "It's not that I don't care, sir. It's because those things don't define who you are, or who I am. The things that matter are what's in here," she said, tapping her chest lightly. Arthur, the billionaire who was fluent in the language of profits and dividends, felt disarmed. He realized that for his entire life, most people who surrounded him were interested in his wealth, his assets, his power. Helena saw him as a man, a father, a grieving human being. The difference was colossal. The house, once a symbol of his financial success, was now transforming into a home, a place of healing and rediscovery. But this rediscovery wasn't just for Leo, it was for Arthur too. He started spending more time with his son, playing in the yard, reading to him, teaching him to plant seeds in the small vegetable patch Helena had started. He began to see the world through Leo's eyes, and the world became a more colorful, less gray place, less about market value and more about the value of life. One evening, Arthur found Helena sitting in the garden, watching the stars. He sat beside her, the silence between them no longer awkward, but comfortable. "Helena," he said, his voice soft, "thank you for everything." She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the vastness of the sky. "I didn't do anything anyone else wouldn't do," she replied humbly. "That's not true," Arthur countered. "No one else did. You changed everything, not just for Leo, but for me." He felt an overwhelming desire to know more about her life, about the woman behind the cleaner's uniform. The curiosity was no longer that of an employer, but that of a man. "Tell me about you, Helena. Tell me about your life." She hesitated for a moment, her head tilted, and then she began to speak. Her voice was calm, weaving stories of loss, of challenges, of overcoming, of a life lived with dignity and resilience. As she spoke, the invisible line that separated them, the line between the billionaire and the cleaner, began to fade, becoming thin and almost non-existent, as if the chasm between their worlds was closing, revealing something new and unexpected on the horizon. Helena's story unfolded under the starry sky, not as a confession of sorrows, but as a quiet testament to human strength. She spoke of her childhood in a small town, of a family held together by simplicity and affection. She spoke of a young love, a happy marriage, and the dream of building a life together, a dream cut short by her husband's sudden illness. Arthur listened in reverent silence as she described the pain of loss, the struggle to raise a daughter alone, the low-paying jobs, and the sleepless nights, not from fear, but from worry. She didn't speak with self-pity. There was a serene acceptance in her voice, the calm of someone who has walked through the storm and found peace on the other side. She told him about her daughter, now a young doctor completing her residency at a public hospital, the pride of her life, the result of all her sacrifice. "All my capital was invested in her education," Helena said, and the word capital sounded so different on her lips, devoid of the financial weight it had always held for Arthur. Her capital was love. It was hope. It was her daughter's future. Arthur felt humbled. His own journey of accumulating a vast fortune in dollars had, for a moment, seemed trivial in comparison to this woman's wealth of spirit. He, who prided himself on his high-risk, high-return investments, realized that Helena had made the most important investment of all, with a cash flow of unconditional love and dividends of pride and fulfillment. "Did you never think of starting over?" Arthur asked, his voice low, testing the waters of this intimate conversation. "Finding someone?" Helena sighed, a soft sound in the night. "My heart had an owner, sir, and when he left, he took the key with him. But that doesn't mean it's closed to love. I just learned that love has many forms, the love for my daughter, the love for a well-tended garden, the love for a child who needs a hand in the dark." The mention of Leo hit him. She wasn't just doing a job, she loved his son. The realization was so clear and so powerful, it left him momentarily speechless. That night, the dynamic between them changed irrevocably. The barrier between employer and employee, already weakened, crumbled completely. They were just a man and a woman, two souls who had known loss and loneliness, finding an unexpected safe harbor in each other. In the weeks that followed, their nightly conversations in the garden became a ritual. They spoke of everything and nothing, of the books they were reading, of the news of the world, of the dreams they had for the future. Arthur found himself sharing with her his own fears and insecurities, things he had never admitted even to his most expensive therapists. He spoke of the pressure of running his businesses, of the loneliness at the top, of the guilt he felt over his wife's death, an illness all his money couldn't cure. He opened up in a way he hadn't in years, and Helena just listened. She didn't offer solutions or business advice. She offered something far more valuable: understanding. She made him feel seen, not as the billionaire Arthur Sterling, but simply as Arthur. Arthur's transformation was not lost on his son. Leo, now a chatty and curious boy, began to include him in his games with Helena. The house, once a silent mausoleum, now echoed with laughter. One afternoon, Arthur was in his office, trying to focus on a report on the cryptocurrency market, when Leo came running in, followed by Helena. "Dad, come see. Helena made a blanket fort in the living room." Arthur hesitated. He had an important conference call in half an hour, but then he looked at his son's expectant face and Helena's knowing smile. He shut down his computer. "I'm on my way," he said. He spent the afternoon inside the blanket fort, reading pirate stories with a flashlight, eating cookies and laughing until his sides hurt. In that moment, surrounded by sheets and cushions, with his son nestled on one side and Helena on the other, he felt like the richest man in the world. The happiness was so pure, so intense, it frightened him. He was falling in love with Helena. The thought was at once terrifying and wonderful. She was his employee. What would people say? What would his business partners think? Logic, protocol, the unwritten rules of his world screamed that it was impossible. But his heart, an organ he had neglected for so long, whispered that it was the only thing that made sense. He was at a crossroads, torn between the empire he had built and the home he was discovering, between the security of his old life and the promise of a happiness he never knew was possible. The awareness of this new feeling brought a fresh layer of complexity to Arthur's life. He became strangely shy around Helena, hyper-aware of every glance, every word exchanged. The man who negotiated multi-billion-dollar deals without flinching now felt like an awkward teenager, unable to articulate his feelings. He tried to disguise it by focusing on practical household matters, but the emotions spilled out in small gestures. A compliment on the dinner she had helped prepare, an insistence that she take time to rest, the purchase of a new set of gardening tools he knew she would appreciate. They were small, almost imperceptible offerings, but they were heavy with his undeclared affection. Helena, with her keen perception of the emotional currents flowing beneath the surface, surely noticed the change, but she gave no sign. She continued to treat him with the same blend of respect and warm familiarity as always, an attitude that both frustrated and relieved him. He feared that a declaration of his feelings might shatter the delicate equilibrium they had achieved, that it might frighten her away, or worse, that she would reject him, seeing his affection as the whim of a rich, lonely man. The uncertainty consumed him, creating an internal conflict as overwhelming as Leo's sleepwalking crisis had been. His empire, his assets, his financial holdings seemed irrelevant in the face of this emotional stalemate. What good was having the power to buy anything he wanted if he couldn't win the heart of the one woman who saw him for who he truly was? One night, the inevitable happened. Leo had a nightmare. It wasn't a sleepwalking episode, but a classic night terror. Arthur woke to his son's screams echoing through the house. He bolted to Leo's room, his heart pounding with an old panic. He found the boy sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear, his body trembling. "It was just a bad dream, son." "Dad's here," Arthur said, hugging him tightly, but Leo was inconsolable, crying and calling out a name. "Helena!" At that moment, the door opened and she entered, as if she had been summoned. She wore a simple robe, her hair down. Her eyes, sleepy but full of concern, went straight to the boy. "I'm here, sweetie. I'm here," she said, her voice soft as velvet. Arthur instinctively moved aside, making room for her. Helena sat on the bed and wrapped Leo in her arms. She didn't say much. She just held him, rocking him gently and humming the same ancient melody she used to soothe his nightly wanderings. Gradually, Leo's trembling subsided, and his crying turned to quiet sobs. "Do you want to tell me about the dream?" she asked. With his head still buried in her shoulder, Leo whispered about a dark hallway and a door he couldn't open. Arthur stood by, watching the scene, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude, admiration, and a pang of jealousy. He was the father, the protector, yet it was Helena, his son, called for in the dark. It was she who held the key to his fears. After Leo had finally calmed down and drifted back to sleep, Arthur and Helena left the room together. In the silent hallway, under the dim light of a wall sconce, the emotional tension between them was almost physical. "Thank you," Arthur said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of his gratitude. You have a gift with him." "It's not a gift," she replied, looking down at her hands. "It's just, I know what it's like to feel lost in the dark." Her gaze met his, and in that instant, all barriers crumbled. The vulnerability in her eyes was an invitation, a silent permission. Arthur could no longer fight what he felt. "It's not just with him, Helena," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You found me in the dark, too." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The air grew heavy with anticipation. He raised his hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, and then touched her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness, a question without words. Helena didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, a silent surrender that made Arthur's heart soar. He knew, in that moment, that his feelings were returned. This hallway, the stage for so many nightmares, was about to become the setting for the most hopeful and terrifying moment of his life. The moment stretched, suspended in the pre-dawn silence. The touch of Arthur's hand on Helena's face was the epicenter of an emotional earthquake, shaking the foundations of both their lives. For him, it was the final capitulation of his loneliness, the admission that his vast fortune and business empire were empty shells without the human connection she had offered him. For her, it was the confirmation that the man she had come to respect and care for saw beyond her station, seeing the woman behind the uniform. The social chasm, the difference in their net worth, the cold logic of the outside world, all of it vanished in that hallway. There was only them, two people brought together by the healing they had brought to each other's lives. "Helena," Arthur whispered, her name both a statement and a plea. He leaned in, moving with torturous slowness, giving her all the time in the world to pull back, but she didn't. She remained still, her face tilted up to his, her eyes still closed in an act of absolute trust. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss devoid of feverish passion, but full of a deep, reverent tenderness. It was the acknowledgement of months of unspoken glances, of conversations that healed old wounds, of the silent partnership in saving a little boy, and in the process, saving themselves. Their lips met with the softness of a promise, a seal on a new beginning. When they parted, the emotion in the air was so thick they could taste it. Arthur kept his hand on her face, his thumb still tracing gentle circles on her skin. He looked into her eyes, now open and shining with a mixture of surprise and something that looked very much like happiness. He started, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know how any of this works. All I know is that I don't want to face the dark alone anymore." A smile, the first truly radiant smile he had ever seen from her, lit up Helena's face. "Neither do I," she answered, her voice a whisper. The simplicity of her acceptance was more powerful than any grand declaration. In that instant, Arthur felt a wave of peace wash over him, a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced since his wife passed away. The tension that had been his constant companion, the anxiety over Leo's future, the loneliness of his own life, all seemed to dissipate in this woman's calm, steady presence. They didn't need a business plan for love or an investment strategy for happiness. They just needed each other. The decision was made, the feeling revealed. The moment of greatest tension had not been a confrontation or a crisis, but that leap into the abyss of vulnerability. The risk was enormous. He was risking the stability of his home, his reputation, and the very dynamic that had become his son's cure. But the potential return on investment, a concept he understood so well, was infinite. It was the chance at a real family, a home filled with love and laughter, a life measured not in dollars or stocks, but in moments of pure, simple joy. They stood there for another moment, two figures in the silent hallway, the ghost of Leo's nightmare finally exorcised and replaced with the promise of a dream. Arthur knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be judgment, obstacles, the complexities of merging two vastly different worlds. But for the first time in a long time, he felt no fear. Looking at Helena, he saw not just a woman he loved, but a partner, an equal, the quiet architect of his life's reconstruction. He took her hand, their fingers lacing together as if they were made for one another. "Let's go inside," he said. "It's getting cold." And as they walked back, side by side, no longer as employer and employee, but as a man and a woman at the beginning of a journey, the dim light from the sconce in the hall seemed to shine brighter, as if the house itself were blessing their union, celebrating the end of the long night and the arrival of a new dawn. The dawn that followed that transformative night brought with it a refreshing clarity. Arthur woke, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders, the guilt and loneliness replaced by a cautious but palpable hope. The resolution of their conflicts, he realized, would not be a dramatic event, but a gradual process of building a new reality, brick by brick. He called a meeting with the entire household staff that morning. Helena stood among them, quiet and observant as always, but there was a new light in her eyes that only Arthur could decipher. He was direct and honest. He announced Judith's dismissal, explaining succinctly that there had been an irreconcilable breach of trust regarding Leo's care, without delving into the sordid details that would only shame them all. Then he looked directly at Helena and, in a calm, firm voice that left no room for gossip, said, "Helena has been instrumental in Leo's improvement and in the well-being of this house. As of today, she will no longer be responsible for cleaning. I have asked her to accept the position of house manager, to help me run the home and, most importantly, to directly oversee everything related to Leo." A murmur went through the room, a mix of surprise and, on most faces, genuine approval. Helena, caught off guard by the public promotion, blushed slightly but met Arthur's gaze and nodded with a quiet dignity. The first brick of their new life had been laid. Leo's narrative arc found its conclusion not in a miraculous cure, but in a reclaimed normalcy. With Helena officially by his side, the boy's sense of security solidified. The nightmares became rare, and the few sleepwalking episodes that occurred were brief and easily soothed. He became a happy, outgoing child whose laughter was now the constant soundtrack of the mansion. The house, once cold and impersonal, a mere asset in his property portfolio, transformed into a home. Arthur, guided by Helena's sensibility, began making small but significant changes. The plastic covers protecting the furniture were removed. Family photos, including many of Arthur's late wife with a baby Leo, were displayed throughout the rooms, and fresh flowers from the garden now adorned every space. The biggest conflict left to resolve, however, was the internal one within Arthur himself. He needed to forgive himself. Helena helped him in this process, not with words of absolution but with actions. She encouraged him to be more involved, to trust his paternal instincts. One afternoon, Leo fell while running in the yard and scraped his knee. Arthur's first reaction was panic, the old fear of not knowing what to do rising to the surface. But Helena, who saw the incident from the window, didn't run out. She just watched him. And Arthur, seeing her look of trust, took a deep breath, scooped his son up, cleaned the wound, and calmed him with a story, just as he had seen Helena do so many times. It was a small moment, but for him, it represented a huge victory. He was capable. He was a good father. The relationship between Arthur and Helena blossomed away from the prying eyes of the outside world. They spent their evenings talking, planning Leo's future, sharing dreams and fears. The financial chasm between them, which once seemed insurmountable, became irrelevant. Arthur discovered that Helena's wisdom about life, about people, and about what truly mattered was a more valuable asset than any stock in his portfolio. She, in turn, never showed interest in his fortune, but rather in the man behind it. She was fascinated by his brilliant business mind, not for the profit it generated, but for the creativity and discipline it required. The climax of the resolution came on a Sunday evening, about a month after the kiss in the hallway. The three of them were in the living room, playing a board game. Leo was laughing, a genuine, carefree laugh. Helena was smiling, looking at the boy with an affection that overflowed, and Arthur, watching them both, felt a wave of happiness so complete, so overwhelming, it took his breath away. The void in his heart, which he thought was a permanent scar from the loss of his wife and his son's illness, was full. He realized that a happy ending wasn't a destination, but a daily choice. The choice to open your heart, to trust, to put love above fear. That night, after Leo was in bed, Arthur took Helena's hand. "Stay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not as my employee, not as the house manager. Stay as my partner. Stay and help me build this new life, our new life." Helena looked at him, her eyes glistening, and her answer was the smile he had grown to love. "I'm already home," she said. The shocking scene in the hallway hadn't been the end of a nightmare, but the beginning of a dream he never knew he had, a dream of family, of belonging, and of a love found in the most unexpected of places. The months that followed were like the gentle changing of seasons, a natural transition into a new landscape of happiness. The cold marble mansion, once a prison of high-tech security and silence, completed its metamorphosis. It became a sanctuary of warmth and life, a place where the most common sound was the laughter of a boy running across the lawn, chasing a ball or simply his own shadow. Arthur's empire, forged in steel and strategy, continued to thrive, but its center of gravity had shifted. He was still a formidable businessman whose decisions on investments and cash flow impacted markets, but the heart of his world was no longer in the skyscrapers downtown, but in the gardens of his home, where Helena now planted sunflowers. Her presence was the anchor that stabilized not just the house, but Arthur's soul. She never tried to fit the mold of a billionaire's wife. She kept her simplicity, her aversion to opulence, her practical wisdom. She was Arthur's moral compass, constantly reminding him of the value of things money couldn't buy. Leo's transformation was the most inspiring proof of the healing power of love and security. He grew into a curious, intelligent, and above all, happy boy. The shadow of sleepwalking vanished completely, becoming a distant memory, a dark chapter that had been overcome. He loved Helena with the pure devotion of a child, and he saw in his father a rediscovered hero, a man who was present and engaged. Arthur and Helena's relationship deepened into a quiet, powerful partnership. They discovered a world of simple joys, walking at sunset, reading the Sunday paper together, the pleasure of cooking a meal side by side. Arthur's vast wealth, rather than being a barrier, became a tool. Together, they established a charitable foundation in the name of Arthur's late wife, dedicated to supporting children who had suffered loss and trauma, ensuring other families could have access to the kind of care and understanding Helena had brought into their lives. The happy ending was not one grand event, but the sum of 1,000 perfect little moments. It was Arthur teaching Leo how to ride a bike, with Helena cheering from the sidewalk. It was Helena reading a story to Leo in bed, with Arthur sitting in the armchair, just watching, his heart overflowing with gratitude. It was a movie night at home. The three of them huddled on the sofa under a blanket, the light from the screen reflecting on their happy faces. One evening, a year after Helena had first walked into his life, Arthur found her in the garden, watching the stars, in the same spot where their story had truly begun. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking about how curious life is," she said, her voice soft. "Sometimes the darkest paths lead us to the most brightly lit places." Arthur tightened his embrace. He looked up at the house, now fully illuminated, each window a warm square of light against the night's darkness. He, the man who had everything and nothing, had found love and family in the most unexpected way. He had learned that a man's greatest asset isn't in his holdings or his bank account, but in the wealth of his heart. The real treasure wasn't gold or cryptocurrency, but the hand you hold in the dark. "Helena," he said, his voice full of a serene certainty, "marry me." She turned in his arms, her face lit by the moon and by love. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times.